All right, folks, for those of you tuning in, this is going to be our final module in this 8-week class. This is Module 8 for our Industrial Safety class, ISC 110. Here we're going to be covering, what happened to my laser pointer? Here we are. We're going to be covering essentially basic welding and cutting safety skills. So let's moving on. At the end of the course, recognize hazards associated with welding, cutting, understand proper PPE, which we learned from a couple modules ago, different types of PPE. And as usual, we're seeing it a lot in these modules, management's responsibility when it comes to safety and proper procedures that are followed for this. First, talk about fire protection. If you can, the best course of action is if something needs to be welded or cut, to move it out of an area that is a potential fire hazard. If not, move the fire hazards out of the area. However, if neither one of those are feasible, what needs to be done is proper protection. Guards, in this case here, we see guards to confine the welding and the cutting to a specific area. So if you've ever done any welding and cutting, you'll know that number one, it generates a tremendous amount of heat, and number two, a lot of sparks will be flying. Kind of the reason why we look over in our welding shop here on campus, we see them doing a lot of the oxyacetylene cutting outside, away from anything that's inside the building that could possibly catch on fire. So moving along here. Some of the basic precautions, we talked a little bit about NFPA throughout the semester. NFPA has a standard when it comes to cutting and welding processes. OSHA does not make any laws. OSHA just basically has a bunch of guidelines. So the guideline that they follow in this case follows under the NFPA. If you can look that up if you wanted to. It just talks, it's a pamphlet, talks about some of the different procedures that are followed. But you see here, management is responsible for following that specific standard. So one of the things we see in this picture right here, if welding and cutting is going to be done, you have to be aware of your surroundings. If sparks are going to be falling down below, in this case here, this is a stairwell, blocking off the stairwell, ensuring that nobody is going to be utilizing that stairwell. If it's metal grating, ensure that nothing is down below that metal grating, whether it be people or combustible materials. You have to understand everything that's around you. If you looked at one of the videos that I uploaded to Blackboard, you see an individual, I think he's running a cutoff torch or maybe welding. Spark goes up and down into a garbage can full of probably oily rags, and it explodes. It wasn't really discussed during this, but there are, procedures that should have been taken as far as the storage of those oily rags. So, there was a lot of problems with that specific video. So things that need to be considered when you're doing that. Fire extinguishers. We learned a couple modules ago the use of fire extinguishers for different types of chemicals and whatnot. Whenever any welding, cutting, and things like that are taking place, having suitable fire extinguisher equipment is very important. It says right here, pails of water. Obviously, you have to know with what you're using. Class A, Class B, Class C, Class K. Things that you're going to be working around, and obviously you don't want to use water around electricity. Buckets of sand, that may be feasible. I know that I've seen a lot of times welders, they'll have somebody with a bucket of sand there to douse anything that could possibly be ignited. One of the things as well is fire watch is required on certain scenarios when welding and cutting are taking place. Combustible material closer than 35 feet. We learned a couple of slides ago, if things are not able to be moved outside of that area, then a fire watch is in that case needed. 35 feet away but easily ignited. There is really no kind of standard that I found on that as far as 35 to what. You know, but if you're doing some cutting and welding and 36 feet away is a main gas line or something like that, then you probably want to have that fire watch posted. And it says other than a minor fire. You know, if we're talking about explosions and things like that. So I guess, you know, to just be on the safe side, it wouldn't be that bad of an idea to have that fire watch posted at all times, you know, unless there is literally zero chance of any possible fire. Fire watch duties, obviously they have to be familiar with their firefighting equipment, how to sound their alarm, you know, how to extinguish the fire, how to do that. The big thing here, and I didn't realize this as I was making this up, I wrote the same thing kind of twice, half an hour. Fire watch, according to OSHA regulations, fire watch needs to stay in the area for at least a half of an hour after the welding and the cutting has been completed. So after half an hour. Authorization. A lot of times you'll have in areas where welding and cutting aren't constantly being done, hot work permits. And that is just getting the authorization that any safety precautions have been checked and been followed before any welding or cutting is taking place. Now, obviously, if you work in a shop that does nothing but welding, you probably don't need that hot work permit. But if you're in a facility and you're doing any welding or cutting in an area that doesn't regularly see it, hot work permit needs to be obtained to verify that that area is safe to have any of these procedures being done. However, there are some prohibited areas not authorized by management. Obviously, if management says you can't do that over there, then you can't. Sprinkler buildings, if they have turned off the sprinklers, can't do it there. Other things that we see, if there's flammable gases in the air, if uncleaned tanks. The reason why I had a skip there is I was thinking about one of the videos that I put in Blackboard. I think it's in the warning folder of somebody is welding on a transformer and the transformer explodes. Obviously, there wasn't a hot work permit done for that because they probably would have identified some of the hazards associated with that. Accumulation of combustible dusts. Most dusts are combustible, so things like that need to be taken into consideration. You see here a bunch of sawdust. That is combustible. Some dust over here, you know, possibility of combustion in that area. So management, they're responsible for the safety. Management is going to be responsible for any of this. They have to establish areas for cutting and welding. Individuals responsible, you know, the safe training of individuals for any of this stuff. And contractors coming in, you have to notify them if contractors are going to be coming in. They need to also be notified of any hazards that may be prevalent in a certain area. So management has a lot of responsibilities when it comes to this, and you know, their key responsibility is the safety of their employees. You know, kind of like a duplicate of what we saw before. Combustible hazardous areas, they have to. Management's responsible for that. Combustibles, keeping the ignition down. They're giving the approval, the hot work permit to that cutter or that welder. Fire watches, remember we talked about that 30 minutes. So essentially, you know, management has those responsibilities. You cannot just go into an area and start welding and cutting without that management's approval. One of the things, there's, I don't know, I think I put it up in there. Somebody's welding on a pipe. It doesn't have anything to do with a connection to being disconnected or blank, but it's kind of an interesting video. But obviously, if they're cutting on a pipe, it is probably pretty important that that pipe has been disconnected or blanked off in this case we see here. Imagine cutting through a pressurized pipeline that cuts through and it cracks. A lot of people can be injured on that. Cutting or welding on drums, you cannot do any hot work on that drum until it has been thoroughly cleaned. you know, you don't want to cut through an old drum that used to contain gasoline, for example. Let's say, oh, the gasoline's all emptied out, it's got no gasoline left in it. Well, it's actually the vapor that is combustible in gasoline and not the actual liquid gasoline itself. So cutting through that, yeah, it's empty, but as soon as you hit that vapor, explosion. And it's created, essentially, you've created a bomb. So it needed to make sure that those containers have been thoroughly cleaned and checked out by management before any of this cutting can take place. Protection of personnel. We talked about a lot of the PPE things. We talked about a couple of lessons ago, working on platforms and scaffolding, having a fall arrest system, safety lines or safety belts, lifelines, things like that need to be incorporated into the aspects. So if you're welding up at the top of a water tower, obviously a lot of other safety precautions need to be taken into consideration versus welding on the ground. Protection from welding rays, enclosed individuals. These are cloth or canvas screens. I've seen them. They're not clear. They're actually like a shaded. These things are helping prevent injury and accidents occurring to not only the welders but the people who are working outside of that area. Flame-proof screens. Those screens are flame-proof. As those sparks, we talked about that. As the sparks are flying, if they're hitting a screen that is flammable, I think the purpose of the screen has probably been it's not beneficial to the safety. So those things need to all be considered when you're working on that. If you go into our welding shop over here, there's a screen. If you look at our welding area that's set up in the back, the grind room here in the machine shop, there's a screen. All of those are for the safety of not only the individual doing the work, but the people who are walking by. Protective clothing, obviously, cowhide leather, gloves, welding mask, welding helmet, welding goggles. All of these things need to be taken into consideration. Now, this is all. I know I'm not going to go into talking about what level of tint these things are required on. This is not a how to weld class. This is a general overview of things that are required. But these items here are the minimum that would be required for the safe operation of welding and cutting equipment. So these are all regulated by OSHA standards. Talk about confined spaces. So OSHA has a definition for a confined space. It's an area that has a small egress area. It is not designed for long-term occupation of an individual. We see here some of the regulations on this. In confined spaces, any of that machining or any of that equipment needs to be left on the outside of that area. It cannot be inside the confined space with that individual. Lifelines, you'll have an attendant. They know exactly what needs to be done in the likelihood that an individual needs to be pulled from that area with a lifeline there. That lifeline is designed that if an individual is rendered unconscious, the attendant can then pull that individual out without entering the confined space, and then you have a twofold problem there. Warning signs. So you may have seen these before if you've ever been in an industrial environment. Warning signs are designed to let people know that something in that area is hot. If you've just finished welding is a couple thousand degrees, and it heats up the metal to where literally the metal becomes liquefied. It takes a while for that to cool down, so a hot work area needs to be identified as a means to warn individuals that area it needs to be off limits. And it says right here, Welder shall mark the hot metal, provide some other means. Other means, if you have an area like it's roped off and says everything beyond here is hot, something needs to be done at least to identify that that is hot. Ventilation, health protection. So there's certain things, contamination, welders are exposed to. They're exposed to fumes, dust, things like that. There needs to be some considerations that are put into place to determine what kind of ventilation needs to be done to keep that welder or anybody in that area safe. Look on the next slide here. Talks about some different things about ventilation. Screens can't block the ventilation. So we talked about the screens, but they can't be in an area that blocks any of the clean air ventilation that the welders or cutters are experiencing. OSHA guidelines has maximum allowable concentration of different fumes and dust that individuals can be exposed to. If there is ventilation, so our welding area over here has downdraft booths. As they're welding in an area, it draws the fumes down away from them. And then hazard communication, HAZCOM. We talked about HAZCOM, I don't know if it was last week or the week before. So HAZCOM needs to be put in. And then we see here safety data sheets. So as I said last week, or the week, I cannot remember. Safety data sheets need to be in place when for any chemicals that may be present in an area, or any chemicals that can be produced. So the fumes from welding is something that's produced. There needs to be an SDS on that. So you can see how all these lessons are kind of now working together on a lot of these things. Compressed gas cylinders here needs to be legibly marked for identifying the gas content. I think we saw that before. All containers need to be properly marked. Anything with a watertight capacity of over 30 pounds, means of connecting a valve protection cap. So these do not have valve protection caps. No, I'm looking at the close-up here. No, they don't have any valve protection caps on them. That would just be that little collar that goes on top. Actually, if I go to the next slide, where is it? That right there is a valve protection cap. I think this is more or less a what not to do slide, but it's put on there for purposes of that. What not to do, how not to handle and carry around your compressed gas cylinders. Keeping away from sources of heat, well ventilated dry locations, away from highly combustible materials, empty cylinders stored with the valves closed. That prevents any contaminants from entering the cylinder. And we talk here, last slide. I knew I was going to make this one quick because I know that you guys are tired after 8 weeks of this. This is the last slide. Utilizing gas cylinders, compressed gas cylinders, stored on a secure truck. If not, the regulators are removed with the valve protection caps. Talked about that. Put in place before the cylinders are moved. So they need to be moved in a safe manner. Rolling a gas cylinder is probably not a good idea. When I say probably, it's not. Okay. Valves opened while standing to one side of the outlet. If I had a gas cylinder here, let's say that this is a gas cylinder. This is the outlet of my valve. I don't want to crack open the valve with that valve pointing towards me. You want to open it with it pointing away. Why? Kind of a twofold thing. If the valve were to explode, it's shrapnel getting sent out to you. The other thing here is we talk about cracking open the valve is it releases any contaminants that are in there, any dust that may have been built up, a wasp nest that got built in there or whatever. You crack open the valve, it blows all the contaminants out. That way you can put on the regulator or whatever needs to be done, so you don't clog up the regulator or jam the regulator. one of the things that we see is that I'm right here. You probably don't want to be cracking open that acetylene towards something that's flammable. If somebody's welding right here, I'm probably not going to crack open the acetylene tank in the direction of the guy that's doing any of the welding. If so, you've just created a massive explosion. That kind of reminds me, I'm going to see if I can find another video of exploding compressed gas cylinders. See if I can put that up on Blackboard. So I'll try to do that right after I close out this video. Short week, short at least presentation. Hope that you've enjoyed or at least found some of these modules useful to you. With that, just don't forget to do your quiz and your discussion board, and everything's going to be due by next Monday at midnight because I have to put the grades in. If you have any questions, stop and see me. Until then, thanks for attending.